Many of you have heard me say years ago when I was between my sophomore and junior year in college, I spent a summer in Africa on a short-term mission trip. And during that time, I heard from God. And that was significant for two reasons, both because God reformatted the direction of my life as I knew it, and secondly, because hearing from God at that point in my life was a tremendous novelty. I grew up in a church that was long on steeples and organs and robes, but short on hearing from God. It just was not a thing that was done per se. And so it surprised me. I wasn't looking for a theophany, was the point. And the Lord told me, you're not going to do the things you're going to do. You're going to serve me for the rest of your life, and you're going to love it. And the sheer fact of my ignorance to the fact that God can be heard from, that was even a thing, testifies in my heart to the authenticity of that call. But more so, the fact that my life pivoted at that point, and I indeed did not do the things I thought I was going to do. And like everyone else who's a citizen of a young overachiever nation in that time, I had a well-crafted plan for my life, but I didn't go to law school and I didn't run for office. I did this, and I do love it. And so I look back on that time with a bit of austerity. That was like, take off your sandals, this is holy ground moment for me. But what I may not have shared is the granular process by which it played out. See, I came to Africa full of the boyish questions of youth and came home with a man-sized revelation of my future. But if it answered one question, it asked 10 more, like how and what, and more than anything, when does this go down? And so, being by default the guy that gets a bit of direction and then earns his living taking it from here and making it easy for the boss to forget about it, and being trained in the virtues of grabbing the bull by the horns, showing initiative, that's everything that the world I came from values. I did what I knew to do and sort of took the bull by the horns and started thinking, all right, I'm supposed to do this and not that. Maybe I ought to drop out of college, but I can't because I have an ROTC scholarship that I'm 2 years into. Maybe I can pay back the first 2 years, and maybe I ought to go to Bible college. Maybe I ought to go be a missionary. What does this mean, Lord? But what I presumed was that whatever exactly it looked like, it started now. Because why else would God have shown it to me now? And so I sort of fumbled my way through 2 more years of college, had a great experience in spite of myself, kind of came to the resolution that I guess he'll show me the next thing when the time comes because no doors opened, and had a great experience there. Owed 4 years of my life to you all, my fellow taxpayers, for buying my education by serving in the Army. So they sent me to Fort Carson, Colorado, where I blew things up with tanks for 4 years, like fake things, not real things. Fortunately, I didn't have to go to war, but paid back my debt to society, all the while consternated on the inside because God had called me. And so you see, not only was I not in the saving business as I felt called to be, but I was in the killing business instead. I was going 180 degrees the opposite direction of my sense of vocation. And that tore me up inside. So I would look for ways to make this thing happen. I remember thinking, when the Air Force announced an early release program where they would terminate your service obligation because they had too many Air Force people. Why does the Air Force always get the good stuff? No one in the Army gets out of their commitment early. Like, you sit behind a desk for 2 years and they're like, oh, we'll call it good because of all that hard work. Just kidding. Just kidding, kind of, but not really. And so that didn't get released early, and I tried, and then you have to be careful or else you get labeled as the guy that wants out, and that's not good for your career. You get the code red with like the soap in the sock and the Jack Nicholson speech, and you know what I'm talking about? You should. All right, so you don't go that far down that road. But then I started thinking, okay, well, if I can't make that happen, I'll wait for the Lord's provision in releasing me early, but I'm going to prepare. I'm going to have my bed made so then I can just sleep in it, right? So I started thinking, well, what do I want to do? Like, what would ministry look like? I didn't really have a mature concept of local church as a vocation. I came from a church that was anything but relevant to society, and that was not what you wanted to be when you grew up. It was like peopled with kindly old men with like ducks embroidered on their corduroys that said, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you. I was awesome men, but not the guy you wanted to be when you grew up if you're me. And so I looked for a different paradigm, and the way that the people that I knew that were actually changing the world like I wanted to do for Jesus were in some sort of parachurch ministry. And the one that was particularly alluring to me was YWAM. Do you know YWAM, Youth with a Mission? YWAM, coolest acronym. And I was new to the world of people who were generally excited about Jesus and worship. And so all of that was lumped together in appealing. And there was some YWAM people in the church I was attending, and I was like, they're so cool, man. They look like they just stepped out of a Grateful Dead concert. And they live by faith, and that kind of like God will provide was the answer to everything. And I was like, I want that. And so I did what I knew to do. I looked up in the phone book my local YWAM base, and I did true confession. I went up there to the base, and there's no like front door and reception office that you'd go in, and I was like, well, that's sort of strange. So I walked in one of the little houses. It was the dining hall, and someone saw me looking like I didn't belong and said, can I help you? And I said, yes, I'm here to apply for a job. And they're like, huh? And they looked at me like I had two heads, and they're like, it doesn't really work that way. I'm like, how precisely then does it work? And they're like, well, you have to do a DTS. And I'm like, okay, what's that? Like, it's discipleship training school, but it's really like this program you do. And I'm like, okay, well, I'd like to work there then. They're like, well, you don't work there. I'm like, well, can you earn a living at it? They're like, no, you actually have to pay for it. And I said, well, I need a job that will pay my rent. And so can I apply for that job? And there was a total disconnect, which if you know YWAM culture, the absurdity of that is not lost on you, right? And if you don't, just trust me, it was highly absurd. Every door I tried to knock on just sort of shut in my face, all the while thinking, God, didn't you call me? How do I make this happen? I came up in the school of God helps those who help themselves. And so I'm trying to help God help me, right? And nothing seemed to be working. Jesus' life gave us a little glimpse into how this is supposed to go. How we follow Jesus once we learn to hear his voice, as we've talked about over the last 6 weeks in our Voice of God series, and begin to discover his call for our life. How does that play out? We're in John chapter 7. We've been studying over the last year through the Gospel of John. We left off at the end of 6 a few weeks ago to take our topical diversion into the voice of God. And where we were was Jesus's probably not most popular sermon, the eat my flesh and drink my blood sermon. Like everything was going well for him and the crowds were growing, and that one sort of like tanked. That was like his episode 1, where I was like, oh, I was loving Star Wars until that. But the whole Jar Jar and the underwater thing, come on, you ruined it. Jesus they lost that love and feeling, right? And so this is where we were in time. And in chapter 7, verse 1, the Bible says, after this, kind of picking the story up, Jesus traveled around Galilee. So he left the big city and went back to the backwater rural regions. He wanted to stay out of Judea, where the Jewish leaders were plotting his death, but soon it was time for the Jewish festival of shelters. And Jesus' brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea, where your followers can see your miracles. You can't become famous if you hide like this. If you can do such wonderful things, show yourself to the world. For even his brothers did not believe in him. Jesus replied, now is not the right time for me to go, but you can go anytime. The world can't hate you, but it does hate me because I accuse it of doing evil. You go on, I'm not going to this festival because my time has not yet come. And after saying these things, Jesus remained in Galilee. But after his brothers left for the festival, Jesus also went, though secretly, staying out of public view. The Jewish leaders tried to find him at the festival and kept asking if anyone had seen him. There was a lot of grumbling about him among the crowds, and some argued he's a good man, but others said he's nothing but a fraud who deceives the people. But none of them had courage to speak favorably about him in public, for they were afraid of getting in trouble with the Jewish leaders. And then, midway through the festival, Jesus went up to the temple and began to teach the people. Our title this morning, A Matter of Time. A matter of time. Verse 6 is the key verse to understanding what exactly is going on here. Jesus told his brothers he wasn't going to go, and then he went secretly, and then later he revealed himself after saying it wasn't quite the right time to reveal himself. Verse 6 finds Jesus telling him, now is not the right time for me to go. A matter of time is our subject. A more literal translation renders that key verse, my time has not yet come. And that word time is the key word in the Greek. It is kairos. And scholars fumble a bit to translate it. It's rendered with idiomatic phrases in various places in the New Testament. It means season or opportune time, perhaps. Period or window of opportunity. Or in the plural, times at which certain foreordained events end up coming to pass. The truth is that there is not one English word that's equivalent to kairos, there are 3 words in ancient Greek that are all translated time or some variation on that theme. Kairos is special. It's more subtle. It's the most nuanced of the 3. It's not merely the chronos time, which, as the transliterations of chronology and the like would suggest, means a sequence of seconds, minutes, or hours. That's time. It's a finite concept. And it's not aura time, H-O-R-A, which is a specific time but non-transcendent. Like you might say, it's time to go, everyone. It's time to go to church, aura. Chronos is different. Chronos is more subjective and, like I said, more transcendent. You might best get the feel of kairos time with an English idiomatic phrase like someone might say to a young aspiring actor or artist, hey, this is your time. Seize the day. Kairos. So why is this significant? Because Jesus' days, he knew, being in very nature God, though not for a time considering equality with God as something to be grasped, Jesus knew that his days were foreordained. His kairos was established. The end of the story was written from the beginning. God had a plan for his life. And this brings us to the foundational truth this morning. This isn't the practical idea that you're going to take and put into play tomorrow morning at work, but this is more of the theological premise, the foundation for understanding this passage, and then the key to understanding what it has to say to our lives. And that is that God exists outside of time. And therefore, he sees the end from the beginning. Jesus knew this. That's why he could say, my kairos has not yet come. He understood that he had a kairos because God works that way. God kairoses. He sees the end from the beginning, and Jesus' days were specifically planned. God exists outside of time and sees the end from the beginning. You could think of it like this. Years ago, Mari and I took a vacation to Hawaii, and we went to the less inhabited island of Kauai. Anyone been to Kauai? Pretty beautiful, right? Amazing. And known for being the wettest point on earth, but it's also fascinating because it's more remote, it's less developed than Honolulu, than Oahu, thank you, or Maui, and there's multiple topographies in this relatively small island. So we did, and some of you probably did this, we did the kayak tour. You can take a bus up the mountain, which is at the middle of the island, as high as you want to go, and then you get in a kayak and you go down all the way to the ocean, right? And so you experience at the top a high alpine climate. And then as you go down into the jungle, which is the wettest point on earth, you feel like you're in the Amazon or like the rainforest, right? And then you pass through that and you come into green rolling hills with a meandering river through them. You'd feel like you were in the heartland of America. And then ultimately, you look like you're for a minute or two at Daytona Beach, where it's white sands and tourists slathered in oil. And then you're in the mouth of the river that feels like the Mississippi. Then you look out at endless expanse of ocean as far as you can see. And so our experience, you might imagine, was mountains, and then jungle, and then meadows, and then beach, and then delta, and then ocean in sequence. But if you weren't in a kayak, if you were on a plane and you were 10,000 feet above Hawaii, you would see all of those topographies as one. You would see the entirety, the headwaters and the mouth of the river, and all the different climate zones in between, and that taken together would be this island. We experience time kind of like the kayak. We see one event, and then the next event, and then the next. God experiences time like the airplane. He sees the whole thing floating together. And the key that you got to understand for this to make sense is we submit to time. It's a force that's constant, and our variable lives flow through it. But time governs us in a sense. God governs time. So it's not as though God is looking at time as an outside or higher entity. Time exists within God and floats like a whole. He sees the entire island. Does that make sense? Okay, here's why this is significant. Galatians 4 says, when the fullness of time had come, that's kairos. Everybody say kairos. Okay, so when the kairos, if you will, had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Jesus' kairos was established. Jesus' days were planned. God knew him, had an incredible, unlikely plan for Jesus' existence on earth. And the thing is, what's true of Jesus is also true of you. It's tempting to think, well, that's Jesus, the greatest person who ever walked the earth, and Jesus who is God, but he's exceptional. But that's just the point, don't you see? The reason Jesus became a man, the reason Jesus walked the earth, was to show us how, as men and women, we can experience the transcendence of our God, how we can follow him, hear him, interact with him, go toward him, live in a kingdom that Jesus said himself is not of this world, while navigating day-to-day life on planet Earth. Jesus set us an example. What's true of Jesus is true of you. And listen, Jeremiah 29 famously makes that point. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. What's true of Jesus is true of you. God has a plan for your life. He sees the whole. He has the end in mind from the beginning. And he cares more about the wonderful plans he has for you than you and I do. Author James Montgomery Boyce put it this way: God does not make decisions because he suddenly is confronted with a problem he has not foreseen. He is never surprised. He's never caught off balance. Thus, there's never a problem that baffles him or a work that he does not intend to finish. Because of this, we can rest in him and trust him for the ordering of our days. In verse 2 of the passage we're looking at this morning, the Bible tells us it was time for the Jewish festival of shelters. What exactly does that mean? There were 3 times during the calendar year of the Jews of Jesus' day when they would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem as a part of their worship, kind of like how everyone goes to church on Easter, times 10. Really big deal. And so they knew that everybody who was thinking about Messiah and the scriptures and God would be there in one place. And so Jesus' brothers said to him, leave here and go there to Jerusalem, to Judea, where your followers, they're all the people who you would like to influence and the people whom you've already earned influence with, they're all going to be there. They can all see your miracles. Listen, you can't become famous if you hide like this. What are you doing? You're missing your window. If you can do such wonderful things, show yourself to the world. And while the brothers, in hindsight, seem a little impertinent in their exhortation, it's really hard to blame them. Don't we kind of live like that? What's tricky about this passage is kind of what's tricky about living a Christian life in the 21st century modern West. And that is that it would seem that this was the moment of opportunity. This, if it's not Kairos, feels an awful lot like it. It's got all the markings of a good old-fashioned Kairos. Now, Bible scholars are divided as to why they were so urgent about Jesus going. Some believe that Jesus just sort of, in their mind, on his road toward fame and influence, took a misstep. It's like having the bad follow-up album. You need to quickly get your third album out so everybody forgets the flop. They remember your smash debut. They're like, hey, Jesus, let's get the momentum back. Come on to this feast. Do your thing. That thing you do it in front of all of them. Others believe it's because of the heightened eschatological awareness of this age. What that means is that the Jews in the first century in Palestine were very attentive to the end times promises of their Old Testament Bible because they were living under Roman oppression. And so when you're living under oppression, you look to a better day, and they look to their scriptures which promised a Messiah, which they easily interpreted in light of current events and thought he's going to be a deliverer. He's going to like put the beret on and go all third world coup d'etat and depose Caesar, right? And so whether they're looking for him to be a military dictator conqueror, or whether they're looking for him merely to redeem his miscue and get back on track, the fact is the 2 different problems had the same fix. And that was, let's go capitalize on this moment of opportunity. Let's stop playing at rinky-dink Paramount theaters, and let's fill the Pepsi Center while you still can. Kind of makes sense if you think about it. They only wanted what seemed best for him. But Jesus in verse 6 replied, "Now is not the right time for me to go, but you can go anytime." What exactly is that supposed to mean? You can go anyway, anytime, but I'm so special, it's not the right time for me. What's Jesus getting at? Well, as he so often does, he's telling them the truth, but he's telling it a little slant. He's not saying it straight. He's leaving it for them to chew on. Here's what, well, it would seem first that his brothers, like many of us, are living out a version of early Christianity, but they're doing it on the world's terms. They're on the world's time. Renowned Bible scholar F.F. Bruce offered this by way of explanation: for people who had no awareness of living from moment to moment in sensitive rapport with God's directing will. That's scholar language for those that didn't get hearing from God and living by every word that proceeds from his mouth. For them, even the Jesus attentive ones, one time was as good as another. But he whose will was regulated by the Father's will would not move until that will was shown. Jesus said in verse 8, "You go on. I'm not going to this festival because my time has not yet come." He didn't not go because it didn't seem like a good opportunity, because it didn't seem like the best opportunity. It didn't seem efficient. He didn't go for any of those reasons. Jesus didn't go simply because it was clear to him that his kairos had not yet come. And therein lies our key principle for this morning. This is what I think this passage means. The right thing at the wrong time is the wrong thing. Let me show you this in a case study in Genesis chapter 15. Back in the beginning, Abram turns into Abraham when God comes to this shepherd and nomad, this ordinary guy, and says, "I'm going to make a covenant with you to make you into a great nation." The covenant that God made with Abraham precipitated the new covenant into which God has joined us as Jesus followers. And he said, your covenant's going to be ratified through two things. I'm going to give you land. That was always a big deal for the people of Israel. I'm going to give you dirt, actual physical ground, and I'm going to give you descendants. You're going to have so many descendants, in fact, sons, daughters, grandkids, great-grandkids, that you couldn't begin to count them. I'm going to make you into a great nation. Genesis 15, Abraham replied, "O sovereign Lord, that's good and well, but what good are all these blessings when I don't even have a son? How can that happen?" And God replied, verse 4, "No, your servant will not be your heir," because he's like, for crying out loud, my will leaves everything I've got to my butler. And God's like, he's not going to be your heir. You're going to have a son who will be your heir. And the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky. Count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you're going to have." Well, in Genesis 16, Abram does what we so often do. He goes all 20th century overachiever child, and when it wasn't happening and he sees himself and his wife, who is as yet unable to have kids, getting older and nothing good happening, he kind of says, "Thanks for the direction, God," takes matters into his own hands, grabs the bull by the horn, and responds to this plot that his wife Sarah comes up with. She'd not been able to bear children, it says in Genesis 16, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai, who becomes Sarah, when Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. So go and sleep with my servant, and perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. And of course, if you know the story, you know this didn't go down well. That is exactly what they did. Hagar gave birth to a child they named Ishmael. God was displeased, saying, "I'm going to do this for you." They cried out and said, "Would you let Ishmael live?" Ishmael did live. He went on. God blessed him, redeemed his situation. He became a nation of his own, not before he and his mom had an unnecessarily hard life because of Abram's poor choice. And Ishmael too grew into a nation. God still fulfilled his promise, but the promise wasn't as easy and the blessing wasn't as comprehensive as perhaps it would have been. And Ishmael's nation fought against Abraham's son Isaac's nation and was a thorn in their side and a challenge to their blessing for centuries. Galatians 5 says, if we live by the Spirit, we ought also to keep in step with the Spirit. If we've come to believe that man does indeed not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, keep listening. So we've heard from God. So we've cultivated the ability to sense his direction. We've come to believe he has good things in store for us. We hear the first good thing and then take off and leave the collar in the dust. Jesus says that's not the way. It is tempting to make that the way. But what we do is create, as it were, an Ishmael. The child, the illicit love child of God's calling and our selfish ambition. And that thing only causes problems in our lives. Learning to hear from God necessitates our taking the next step of maturity, which is learning to submit to God's timing. Because the right thing at the wrong time is the wrong thing. Psalm 27 says, I'm confident I will see the Lord's goodness while I'm here in the land of the living. So wait patiently for the Lord and be brave and courageous. Because I'm confident in the one who called me, that I will see his goodness even if I have yet not experienced it to its fullness. I will wait on the Lord. And he says, be courageous and strong. That's an odd association with patience. In our culture, it doesn't take courage to be patient and wait. It takes courage to grab the bull by the horns. We're rewarded for the pseudo-theology that God can't steer a parked car. We're rewarded for taking the prudential advice that we got from our grandpa, that God helps those who help themselves. We're rewarded in our culture by hearing an inkling of direction and saying, I got this, thanks, and then charging ahead. We think the courage belongs to the one who makes his own luck. But the Bible teaches that the greatest courage belongs to the one who sees the future, who has the capacity to grab the bull by the horns and yet sits back and waits on the Lord. That's the hard work, but that's where the blessing of God comes. I finished my time in the service, all the while waiting for that early separation call that would have seemed like God's provision. It never came. I never got the sweetheart Air Force get out and we'll pay you for it offer. I did 4 years to the day. And in the last 6 months was the first time I really had to have faith again, I realized. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, it was those moments, having almost abandoned hope and relegated that call in the desert to a heightened emotional period. I was mature and grown up now. I had worked in the adult world for 4 years, and I thought, oh, that was the immature, emotional, mountaintop retreat moment. That's all that was. And then I had to give the Army a decision as to whether I was going to continue and take on a promotion, a transfer, and another obligation of time, or I was going to resign my commission. And that's when I thought, did God really say? And I gave notice, told him I wouldn't be continuing, and had to go to the classes for separation and transition where it's career prep classes for junior officers. What that means is you meet up with headhunters who are savvy to how to parlay combat arms service into working for GM, right? They learn how to speak both languages and translate your experience of leadership into what they're looking for. And I said, I don't want to go to the headhunters. That's not my direction. But that world doesn't only reward, but expects preparedness. Everybody had plans A, B, and C for what they were going to do if they were separating from service. And so to say when people asked, what are you going to do next? I have no idea, was not only looked down on, it was considered irresponsible. It was scoffed at. And I had waited now 6.5 years for God to, or I guess 7.5 years, for God to say what came next. And I thought, he may not be saying this. I may be flying blind. But when I told him no, I'm not going to continue, And no, I'm not going to go to the courses. It was kind of like when Luke flipped off his targeting computer just before going into the trench, to blow up the Death Star. That was the moment where I had to decide whether I believe all this or not. And then another couple months passed, and I was getting close, and I started to think, wow, I guess I could wait tables. I got to do something. I'm going to have to pay rent. And all the while, over those years, unwittingly, that it was a link to my future. Again, my understanding and paradigm of local church, having been redeemed by being a part of a great church, still didn't lead to a sort of vocational connection. I didn't see that as the way I was going to change the world according to God's call for me. But I'd started volunteering in the youth group because the pastor stood up and said, hey, we need some people to go on the youth retreat and help chaperone. And my dad's voice echoed in my head, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And my dad had all these aphorisms that would always bounce in my head at just the wrong time, right? And so I was like, oh, I can go. So I took a week of leave and went on the summer camp with the high school kids, and then came out of that and started volunteering in the high school kids group because I liked some of the kids, and I was single and had time on my hands and didn't want to get into trouble with my spare time. So started leading a boys' small group. And then into my group wandered the 15-year-old son of the pastor of the church. This is a big church. It was like 10,000 people. So still didn't see the dots connecting. God did, and developed a bit of a relationship, which led to a bit of a relationship with the pastor. But when your church is 10,000 and you're one guy in the sea of seats, you don't look for a friendship. And then one day my phone rang in my office, and it was him, and he said, "You want to come work for me?" And we were definitely not on calling each other during the day basis. He asked, "When do you get out of the service?" I didn't know that he knew I was in the service, and I told him in 3 or 4 months. He said, "What do you plan to do?" And I said, "I don't know." I thought, well, this is my pastor, so I can tell him the truth. The truth is I sensed years ago that God called me to ministry, but it hasn't really panned out. He said, "Well, what have you been doing?" I said, "I've been in the Army because I had to be." He's like, "Well, maybe it just hasn't panned out yet." He said his life had kind of blown up in a good way at this point, a lot of influence, and he said, "I kind of need a general's aide, and seems like you'd be perfect. You get local church, you come from military, you want to do that." And there began the rest of my life, and I've never not worked for a church since. And indeed, God has led me on a path that was different from the one I imagined, and I've never loved anything more. Now, I'm not telling you that because my story is important. I'm telling you that because God's timing is so important. After his brothers left for the festival, Jesus also went, though secretly staying out of public view. And then midway through the festival, Jesus went up to the temple and began to preach. God, it would seem, said, "Now, right now, it's your time." Didn't give him a lot of advance notice, but his time came. And that's our practical takeaway. That's what you can tuck away and tomorrow morning put into practice from this passage. God will unfold his plan in his time. Don't fight him on it. Even if he lets you have your way, it's only going to make things harder. God will unfold his plan in his time, so don't fight him on it. Philippians 1:6 says, "I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it's finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns." 1 Thessalonians 5 adds, "The one who called you is completely dependable. If he said it, he'll do it." So let me leave you with these ideas, putting this into practice. Trusting God's timing first, it's important to distinguish, doesn't mean over-spiritualizing every decision. Okay? When we realize that we live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, that God has a plan for us that's comprehensive, and that God speaks ongoingly, we can sometimes, if we're not careful, swing that pendulum to the other extreme and get immobilized with spirituality, like pseudo-spirituality, where we got to pray about which pair of contrasting pattern socks to wear with our interview suit. God also gives us wisdom to make prudential decisions, and he will distinguish when to wait on him and when simply to go forward. But don't fall into the trap of over-spiritualizing every decision. That's not what it means to trust God. Trusting God's timing takes being willing to consider more than just open-door theology. Do you know what I mean by that? Lots of us grow to the point of experiencing God's leading through open doors and closed doors, as in, if the door opens, it must be God, and if the door closes, it must not be. Let me tell you, sometimes 5 doors open and none of them are God, And then there are other times when all the doors shut and God's gonna go Chuck Norris on one of them, lower the shoulder and barricade that, or barrel, what do you do with it when you lower your shoulder? Bowl through, that's the word I'm looking for. Lower the shoulder and bowl through that door. He just wants you to sit back and see him do something amazing because he's crazy about you and he wants you in the process of getting the door open to know that he loves coming to your rescue. Am I saying that God never leads through open and closed doors? No, I'm simply saying that is an elementary understanding of God's will. Trusting God's timing requires that we grow beyond that. Because listen, it kind of creates a fait accompli, doesn't it? It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy because the better you do in following God and stewarding the gifts he's given you, the more doors open. And the more doors open, the more unlikely any one open door is going to be God. If you trust God, he, the Bible says, will make your plans succeed. And when your plans succeed, more people want to hire you, more people want to marry you, more people want to promote you. All that glitters is in God. And trusting God with his timing for our lives requires us to put the open door theology that we've maybe navigated a good bit of life with into perspective and submit that to the still small voice of God. And lastly, trusting God's timing requires, at the end of the day, surrendering our perfect plans. It's really what it comes down to. It comes down to faith or fear. That's your choice. Because when we hold those things with the white knuckle grip, once God gives us a vapor of direction, what are we really doing? But if we're honest, fearing that if we let go of that thing just a little bit, it's gonna take off. God's gonna move on to somebody who was able to hold it tighter. It's fear that if it's not now, it's never. If I don't get while the getting's good, I may never get again. But faith takes what we believe to be from God and holds that thing loosely before him and says, God, even if you want to take it away, even if it pleases you more on second thought, not to involve me at all. I want you more than I want it because I believe that you're a good father. I believe you've got great plans for me. And if they're not the thing I was holding on to, maybe there's something better. Martin Luther said, we so often cling to silver when God's waiting to give us gold. Maybe that was just silver and you were testing me. But trusting God's timing means we hold it all loosely. We let go of the white knuckle grip on our perfect plans for our lives. Because either you follow God's plan or you follow yours. There is no halfway. Would you stand with me? It's time for us to go. The Word of God says, I know the plans I have for you. That's what your Father says when he looks at you. He says, I know you don't know them all yet, but more than I want you to do the work, I'm not short of labor. I can get other people to do the work. I want you to want me. I want you to trust me. I want you to enjoy me. I know the plans I've got. I'm not bamboozled by the decision you're facing. I'm not put off by the way your boss is working out his inner damage on you. I'm not hindered by your financial struggle. I know the plans I have for you, says your Father. They're good. They're to prosper you. They're to bless you. They're to give you hope again, an incredible future. Will you trust me in them? Father, thanks for the good work you do in our lives. Thank you, Jesus, for setting us